Welcome back to Crime Time Inc.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock back to March 1971. Picture this. The Vietnam War is raging. Protests are erupting across the country, and everyone's on edge waiting for the fight of the century. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier.
And right in the thick of it all, a group of seemingly ordinary people pulled off something straight out of a spy movie. They broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and now you might think, okay, they must have been after money, right? Or maybe some secret files or something like that.
Yeah, jewels.
But their target was actually something much more valuable. They were after proof that the FBI was illegally spying on American citizens and trying to silence dissent.
It's wild, right? You said ordinary people. We're talking about a daycare worker, a professor, a cab driver, folks you wouldn't expect to be masterminds behind a heist.
Exactly, and what's even more incredible is the risk they took. Especially John and Bonnie Rands, they had 3 young kids, an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and even a 2-year-old.
I mean, that blows my mind. Can you imagine the pressure? Having a family and putting yourself on the line like that. What do you think pushed them to that point?
It really makes you think about the conventions they must have had. These weren't career criminals. They had regular lives, and yet they were willing to risk it all.
And we can't forget about the planning. They didn't just waltz in there. They took locksmithing lessons, studied the FBI office routines, and even used the Ali Frazier fight as cover, figuring everyone would be too distracted to notice.
Talk about meticulous, right down to choosing the night of the fight when the office would be practically deserted.
So they get in, the FBI office is basically empty. And what do they find? So they find what they're looking for.
Oh, they hit the jackpot. They uncover mountains of files confirming their worst fears. This wasn't just some hunch they had stumbled onto. Proof of a massive secret FBI program called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program.
COINTELPRO. Was this some kind of rogue operation, or was this officially sanctioned?
Oh, this was no rogue operation. This was J. Edgar Hoover's baby. A full-blown illegal program designed to disrupt and discredit anyone deemed subversive.
So subversive basically meant anyone who disagreed with the government.
Basically, yeah. And the targets were all over the map. Think civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., anti-war protesters, even Black-owned bookstores. But it wasn't limited to just activists. Hoover also targeted diplomats, government employees, anyone he considered a threat.
Wow. So the FBI wasn't just going after suspected criminals or terrorists. They were spying on anyone who dared to question the status quo.
Exactly. And their tactics were pretty wild. We're talking burglaries, forged letters, planting fake news stories, even attempts to blackmail people and incite violence.
Wait, hold on. They actually tried to blackmail Martin Luther King Jr.?
Yes, they tried to pressure him into taking his own life. It was a dark chapter in American history, all happening in secret until these ordinary citizens decided to do something about it.
Okay, so they had these explosive files in their hands. Then what? What did they do with them?
They decided to go public. They sent copies of the files to journalists, including Betty Metzger at the Washington Post.
Wow, going straight to the media. That's a bold move.
It was a risk for sure, but it paid off big time. Metzger's articles about the stolen files created a national uproar. Congress launched investigations, and people started demanding reform.
It's amazing to think about, isn't it? These people with a crowbar and a sense of justice managed to expose one of the biggest government scandals in U.S. history. They actually changed the course of history.
Absolutely. And it was decades before Edward Snowden and the NSA leaks, but the parallels are undeniable, right? Government overreach, secret surveillance programs, and ordinary people risking everything to expose the truth.
Okay, so the break-in happens. These files are released. What happens to the burglars? Do they just disappear?
Not exactly. They stayed anonymous for over 40 years. Think about that. They managed to keep this huge secret, protect each other, and live seemingly normal lives while this whole story played out.
Wow, the weight of that secret year after year, it's hard to even imagine. Why do you think they stayed silent for so long?
I think it was a combination of factors. They were ready to face the consequences of their actions, but they also understood the importance of protecting themselves and the others involved.
It must have taken incredible strength and trust to keep that secret bottled up for so long. So what finally made them come forward after all those years?
In 2014, Betty Metzger, who had written a book about the burglary, the discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's secret FBI, managed to track down some of the burglars and convince them to tell their story.
So after 4 decades, they decided it was finally time to step out of the shadows and take credit for what they had done.
Yeah, I think they felt that the lessons of the media break-in were more relevant than ever, especially with the Snowden revelations and the growing concerns about government surveillance. They wanted to remind people that this fight for privacy and accountability never really ends.
It's like their story serves as a warning, a reminder that we can't take our freedoms for granted. We have to constantly be vigilant and hold our leaders accountable.
That's exactly right. Their actions showed that even ordinary people can make a huge difference even when facing seemingly impossible odds. It's a testament to the power of courage, conviction, and, maybe even a good crowbar.
All right, so we've got the burglars, their story, their motivations, but let's talk about the impact of COINTELPRO itself. Did their actions actually stop it?
While exposing COINTELPRO definitely led to some reforms, Congress held hearings, the FBI had to scale back some of its activities, and in 1978, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, was passed.
What exactly is FISA?
Essentially, it created a special court to oversee government surveillance requests. It was meant to provide some checks and balances to prevent the kind of abuses that COINTELPRO was engaged in.
So some safeguards were put in place. But has that really stopped the government from overstepping its boundaries?
As we've seen in recent years with events like the 9/11 attacks, the Patriot Act, the Snowden leaks, the debate over privacy versus security is far from over.
It feels like with technology evolving so rapidly, it's even easier for the government to keep tabs on its citizens, our phones, computers, social media. It's all trackable.
You're absolutely right. The tools of surveillance have become incredibly sophisticated, and that raises a whole new set of ethical and legal questions. The media burglary exposed the dangers of government overreach back then, but the battle for privacy is still being fought today.
It makes you wonder, what secrets are still out there right now? And who will be brave enough to bring them to light?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The media burglary serves as a powerful reminder that we can't afford to be complacent. We have to be vigilant, hold our leaders accountable, and speak truth to power, no matter the cost.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. The who, the what, the why of the media FBI break-in. We've seen how a group of regular people exposed a massive scandal and sparked a debate about privacy and security that continues to this day. But there's another side to this story, a more personal one.
You're talking about the impact that COINTELPRO had on the people who were targeted by it and the toll that keeping the secret took on the burglars themselves.
Exactly. The FBI's actions had devastating consequences for many of its victims. Careers were ruined, reputations destroyed, relationships shattered. And even though COINTELPRO officially ended in 1971, its legacy of paranoia and distrust lingered for decades.
Absolutely. Imagine living with the constant suspicion that your friends, your neighbors, even your own family might be informing on you to the FBI. That kind of fear can erode trust and tear communities apart.
And for the burglars themselves, keeping that secret for over 40 years must have been an immense burden.
You can only imagine the weight of that, knowing what they had done. The risks they took, the potential consequences if their identities were ever revealed. It must have put a tremendous strain on their relationships, their families, their entire lives.
It's a side of the story we don't often hear about: the human cost of resistance, the sacrifices that people make when they stand up for their beliefs.
It's a good point. It reminds us that even acts of courage, even those done for noble causes, can have far-reaching and sometimes unintended consequences.
So we've explored the who, the what, and the why of the media FBI break-in. We've talked about how a group of everyday citizens brought a massive government scandal to light and sparked a debate about privacy and security that continues to this day. But there's another layer to this story, a moral dilemma that I think is important to discuss.
You're talking about whether the ends justify the means. Is it ever okay to break the law, even if you believe you're doing it for a greater good?
Exactly. The burglars in this case believed they were justified in their actions. They felt that the FBI was engaged in illegal and unethical activities, and they had a moral obligation to expose them.
And their actions did have some positive results. COINTELPRO was exposed, there were reforms and public awareness about government overreach increased, but there's no denying that they broke the law, they committed a crime. Some people argue that no matter how good their intentions were, that's simply unacceptable.
Right, so that's the heart of the issue. It's incredibly complex. On one hand, we value the rule of law. On the other, we recognize that sometimes laws can be unjust or used to suppress dissent and violate people's rights.
So the question becomes, how do we reconcile those competing values? When is it okay to break the law? And who gets to decide?
It's a question that philosophers and legal scholars have been debating for centuries, and it's a question we each have to wrestle with based on our own values and beliefs.
And it's a question that feels even more relevant today with all the polarization and social unrest we're seeing. More and more people are engaging in protests, demonstrations, and acts of civil disobedience, often in response to perceived injustice.
And in those situations, the question of whether the ends justify the means becomes even more urgent. How far are we willing to go to fight for what we believe in? And at what point do our actions cross the line?
It's a tough question, and one that demands careful consideration.
It certainly does. It challenges us to really think critically about our values, our responsibilities, and the limits of acceptable behavior in a democratic society.
And it reminds us that the fight for justice is rarely simple or straightforward. It's often messy, complicated, and full of difficult choices.
So we've talked about the burglars, their motivations, the impact they had, and the moral questions their actions raise. But what does all this mean for us, the everyday listener, who isn't planning on breaking into any FBI offices anytime soon?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways from the media burglary is that we all have a role to play in safeguarding our freedoms. We can't just sit back and assume that our rights will be protected. We have to be informed, engaged, and willing to speak out against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable.
It's easy to feel powerless when you think about things like government overreach or these large-scale problems.
Yeah.
But the media burglary shows us that even small acts of resistance can have a ripple effect.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder that change is possible, and that it often starts with individuals who are willing to take a stand, speak truth to power, and demand better from their leaders.
And sometimes it takes a crowbar.
Well, maybe not always a crowbar, but definitely a willingness to challenge the status quo and fight for what's right, even when it's tough.
Well said. So the media FBI break-in, a story of courage, conviction, and a healthy dose of audacity. It reminds us that history isn't just made by presidents and politicians. It's made by ordinary people who are willing to stand up for their beliefs.
And it's a story that continues to resonate today as we face new challenges to our privacy, our freedoms, and our democracy. It reminds us that we have to be vigilant and engaged in order to protect the rights we hold dear.
And it shows us that sometimes the most unlikely heroes come from the most ordinary backgrounds, people who are willing to risk everything for what they believe in.
It's a story that makes you think about the choices we make when we see injustice happening around us. Do we stay silent, hoping someone else will speak up? Or do we take a stand, even if it means putting ourselves at risk?
It's a powerful question, and there's no easy answer. What would you have done?
Honestly, it's a question I've asked myself many times, and I don't know if I have a clear answer. It's a decision that each of us has to make based on our own conscience and our own sense of right and wrong.
But the burglars in this case clearly felt they had to act. They couldn't stay silent.
That's right. Their story is a testament to the power of conscience, the idea that we each have a responsibility to speak out against injustice, even when it's dangerous or unpopular.
It's a story that reminds us that history is often shaped not by grand speeches or laws, but by the actions of everyday people who decide they've had enough.
Exactly. The people who broke into that FBI office weren't politicians or revolutionaries. They were ordinary citizens who took a stand, and their actions had a profound impact on history.
It's inspiring, isn't it? It shows that you don't have to be famous or powerful to make a difference. We all have the potential to create change and build a more just world.
Absolutely. And sometimes all it takes is a little courage, a little conviction, and maybe a good locksmith.
Right on. Speaking of locksmiths, let's go back to that night in media. Can you imagine the tension those 8 people must have felt as they carried out their plan?
Oh, I can only imagine. They had every detail planned out, from picking the lock to disabling the deadbolt to stuffing those stolen files into suitcases. But even with all that preparation, there must have been moments of sheer terror, right? The fear of getting caught, the knowledge that if they failed, the consequences would be severe.
Especially for John and Bonnie Raines with their young children at home. I wonder what was going through their minds as they sifted through those files.
On one hand, I'm sure there was a sense of urgency, the need to get as much evidence as possible before they were discovered. But on the other hand, maybe there was also a sense of vindication, of the confirmation that their suspicions about the FBI were true.
And then that moment when they finally escape with the files, their hearts pounding as they drive away from the FBI office.
I must have felt surreal, like something out of a movie, knowing that this was real life and the stakes were incredibly high.
And then the aftermath, the stolen files, sent to reporters, the story breaking. In the Washington Post, this small-town heist suddenly becoming a national scandal.
It's a story with so many layers: the daring break-in, the anonymous whistleblowers, the government cover-up, the decades of secrecy. It's all incredibly compelling.
And then after all those years, The burglars' identities are revealed, and they step into the spotlight. What a moment.
It's a remarkable turn of events, isn't it? These individuals who had risked so much, who had kept their secret for so long, finally get to share their story, their motivations, their hopes, their fears.
And their message resonates with people today, especially as we grapple with increasing concerns about government surveillance and the erosion of our privacy.
It's a reminder that we can't just trust that our government will always act in our best interests. We have to be vigilant and hold our leaders accountable.
We have a responsibility to speak out against injustice and demand transparency from those in power.
And that's a message that's just as relevant today as it was in 1971.
Absolutely. It's a message worth repeating, especially now when we're seeing so many threats to our democracy, our freedoms, and our rights.
You're right. It's easy to become complacent and assume that someone else will fight for our rights, but the media break-in reminds us that we can't afford to be passive observers.
We all have a role to play in protecting our freedoms, whether it's speaking out against injustice, supporting organizations that are fighting for our rights, or simply staying informed and engaged.
And sometimes it might even mean taking more drastic action, like those brave individuals who broke into that FBI office in media.
Now, I'm not suggesting that we all need to start breaking into government buildings,
Yeah.
but that spirit of defiance, that courage, that willingness to stand up for what's right, that's something we can all embrace.
I agree completely. It's about recognizing that we have a voice, we have power, and we can make a difference even when things seem impossible.
And that's a powerful message, one that gives us all hope.
It certainly does. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are always those who are willing to stand up for what they believe in, to fight for justice, and to risk everything for a better world.
And that's something worth celebrating, the spirit of those who refuse to be silenced, who refuse to accept injustice, and who dare to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. Their stories inspire us, they give us courage, and they remind us that even in the face of great adversity, the human spirit can prevail.
And sometimes it takes a break-in to remind us of that.
Well, maybe not always a break-in, but certainly a willingness to challenge the status quo, to push the boundaries of what's possible, and to fight for a more just and equitable world. That's the legacy of the media FBI break-in.
It's been quite a ride so far, right? We've gone from a seemingly straightforward break-in to this deep dive into government overreach, civil liberties, the power of conscience.
Yeah, we've talked about the burglars themselves, why they did what they did, what impact. It had all the ethical questions that come up. But there's one more piece of this story that we need to address, something that I think often gets overlooked.
What's that?
The question of violence.
Yeah, that's a good point. When people hear about a break-in, they automatically imagine something destructive, maybe even dangerous. But the media burglary was actually remarkably peaceful.
Exactly. There were no weapons involved, no threats, no injuries. The burglars were incredibly careful to avoid any kind of confrontation. And they succeeded. They got what they were looking for without harming anyone.
Which is pretty amazing when you think about it. I mean, they could have easily run into a security guard or a janitor or someone, but they didn't.
Right, and I think that's a crucial point to emphasize because it really speaks to their character. They were obviously deeply committed to their cause, but they were equally committed to nonviolence.
It shows that their goal wasn't to hurt anyone or get revenge. They were driven by this desire to expose the truth.
Precisely. And I think that's one of the reasons why this story is so powerful. It's a story about peaceful resistance, right? The idea that you can fight for what you believe in without resorting to violence.
And it highlights that sometimes the most effective way to fight injustice is to simply shine a light on it, expose it for what it is.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what the burglars did. They brought the FBI's secrets out into the open. And in doing so, they forced the country to confront this issue of government overreach.
And that conversation is still going on today, isn't it? We're still trying to find that balance between security and freedom, between privacy and transparency.
Oh, absolutely. The media burglary might have happened over 50 years ago, but the issues it raised are just as relevant now as they were then.
So what can we learn from this story? What lessons can we take from these 8 individuals who took such a huge risk?
Well, for one thing, it's a reminder that we can't be complacent, right? We can't just assume that our rights will be protected. We have to stay informed, we have to stay involved, and we have to be willing to speak out against injustice.
Yeah, it's easy to feel like our voices don't matter, especially when you're up against something as big as the government. But this story proves that's not true.
Exactly. It shows that even when you're facing overwhelming odds, even a small group of dedicated individuals can make a difference. They can expose injustice and spark a movement for change.
It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to hold our leaders accountable, to demand transparency, and to push back against abuses of power.
You got it. And it also shows us that anyone, even ordinary people like us, can make a difference. You don't have to be a politician or an activist to fight for what you believe in.
Sometimes it takes a little courage, a little conviction, and maybe a good locksmith.
Maybe. So I'm not saying we should all go out and start breaking into government buildings.
Although that would be pretty exciting.
It would. But that spirit of defiance, that courage, that willingness to stand up for what's right, that's something we can all try to embody in our own lives.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's about realizing that we have a voice, that we have power, and that we can make a difference even when the odds seem stacked against us. What stands out to you about this whole story?
You know what really strikes me is how this group of people from such different backgrounds came together. You had a professor, a social worker, a daycare worker, a graduate student, all these different walks of life united by this common purpose.
It's true. They were willing to risk everything for this. Their careers, their families, their freedom. What do you think was the driving force behind that?
I think it was this deep sense of moral conviction. You know, they truly believed that what the FBI was doing was wrong, and they felt like they had to act. They couldn't just stand by and let the government violate people's basic rights.
That's a good point. And it's interesting because at the time, they couldn't have known what the impact of their actions would be. They didn't know if anyone would believe them or if it would actually lead to any real change.
And that's the thing about taking a stand for what you believe in. You often have to do it without any guarantee of success. But they were willing to take that risk.
And in a way, they were incredibly successful. I mean, their actions led to some major reforms, and they really brought this issue of government surveillance into the public eye. It sparked a debate that's still going on today.
It did. And I think it's a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference. You never know how far-reaching the consequences of your actions might be.
So for those listening who might be feeling a little overwhelmed by everything happening in the world right now, what would you say to them? What can they learn from these media burglars?
I'd say don't underestimate the power of your own voice. Don't be afraid to speak up for what you believe in. You never know who you might inspire or what kind of change you might set in motion. You know, it's easy to get lost in all the political stuff and the legalities of it all, but when you strip it all away, this story is really about courage.
Yeah, no doubt. It takes some serious guts to go up against the FBI, the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country.
Right. And these were just regular folks, not like trained revolutionaries or anything like that.
And thinking back to what we talked about earlier with their planning,
Yeah.
it's obvious they wanted to minimize any risk of violence.
Exactly. The locksmithing lessons, choosing the night when the office would be pretty much empty, they clearly didn't want any confrontation.
And they pulled it off. No one got hurt. They didn't even threaten anyone. It's pretty remarkable when you think about what they were doing.
It really is. I think it speaks volumes about their principles, their belief that you can fight for what's right without resorting to violence.
It makes you think, doesn't it? What if they hadn't broken in? What if they hadn't exposed COINTELPRO? Would we even know about any of this today?
That's a good question. It's hard to say for sure, but it's possible those files would have stayed buried. Those abuses of power might have continued for who knows how long.
They didn't just expose a crime. They really sparked this whole national conversation about the limits of government power. And that conversation is still going strong today.
Oh, absolutely. The questions they raised about surveillance, about privacy, about how we balance security and freedom, those are questions we're still grappling with.
And as technology keeps advancing, those questions become even more complex and more important.
Right. The media burglary might feel like something from a history book, but in a lot of ways it was a preview of the challenges we face today in this digital age.
Well said. I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up. This has been a fascinating conversation.
It really has, and I hope it encourages everyone listening to think about their own role in the ongoing fight for justice and accountability.
Absolutely. We all have a part to play. Thanks for joining us on Crime Time, Inc. We'll be back tomorrow with another deep dive into a captivating true crime story.